Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Glennis Young. I'm chair of the History Department at the University of Washington, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's event. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize that the University of Washington is housed on the historic and contemporary lands of the Duwamish, Suquamish, and Muckleshoot nations and other Coast Salish peoples who call the waters and coastlines of the Salish Sea home. To acknowledge the traditional territory is to recognize its longer history, reaching beyond colonization and the establishment of European colonies, as well as its significance for the indigenous peoples who lived and continue to live upon this land. Let this be a call to action to increase public consciousness of native sovereignty and cultural rights. Before we begin today's event, I'd also like to say that the Department of History fully supports the University of Washington's Race and Equity Initiative. Our department is committed to teaching, scholarship, and public service that seeks to identify and dismantle structural racial injustice. And now to today's event. I am just delighted that my friend and colleague, Professor Nancy Bristow, chair of the History Department at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, is with us today to speak on, as you see, Pandemic Then and Now, COVID-19 through the lens of the 1918 influenza crisis. Professor Bristow, who recently published an article in Time magazine, is the author of American Pandemic, The Lost Worlds of the 1918 Influenza Epidemic, published by Oxford University Press in 2012. We're so looking forward to her insights. So the format for today's presentation is going to be as follows. My colleague, Professor James Gregory, a specialist in 20th century US history and associate chair, will say a few more words about Professor Bristow, including about the book she just published last month. And then after Professor Bristow's talk, my colleague Bruce Hevely, a specialist in the history of science and editor of Pacific Northwest Quarterly, will moderate the question and answer session. Please send your questions to him via the chat function. So here now is Professor Gregory to say a few more words about Professor Bristow.
Welcome, everyone. It is a distinct pleasure to take this moment, and it's going to be quick, to introduce Dr. Nancy Bristow, whom I've had the pleasure of knowing for many years. As Dr. Young mentioned, she's a professor of history at the University of Puget Sound, where she teaches courses in United States history with an emphasis on race, catastrophe, and social change. She's the author of several important books. I'm going to mention two that are of particular relevance immediately today. As Dr. Young mentioned, in 2012, Professor Bristow published American Pandemic, The Lost Worlds of the 1918 Influenza Epidemic. That book made her the foremost expert on the 1918 pandemic, and that's her subject today. But just last month, Oxford University Press released her most recent book. Sadly, that book is equally relevant to today's catastrophes. The title is Steeped in the Blood of Racism, Black Power, Law and Order, and the 1970 Shootings at Jackson State College. This was timed to mark the 50th anniversary of the police killings of Black young people in Mississippi, a week after the Kent State shootings in 1970. It is absolutely relevant to what's going on today, and I'm only sorry that she can't talk about both books. But right now, I just want to thank her for being with us and invite you to listen to Nancy Bristow talk about the COVID-19 pandemic through the lens of the 1918 influenza crisis. Professor Bristow.
Thank you so much, Professor Gregory, and thank you to the UW History Department and the Pacific Northwest Quarterly for inviting me. Special thanks go to Glennis Young, Jim Gregory, Bruce Heavley, and Alexandra Cawley. It really is just an honor to be with all of you while we're trying to figure out what this world is that we're living in right now and the ways in which perhaps the past can help us make some sense of it. I want to acknowledge as well the ongoing crisis of violence against Black and brown bodies and the agony and grief that it is meaning for people all over the country and surely among our audience, myself included today as well, even as I recognize that that grief is differentially located. So let us turn though to the other crisis, the COVID-19 crisis. In the midst of the influenza pandemic of 1918, the Baltimore Afro-American detailed the costs of what it called one of the most pitiable cases of racism that had occurred in the midst of the crisis. It described an unknown man who was found unconscious, and the paper described the struggle that they had had trying to find space for him in one of the two Black hospitals in the city, both of which were already overwhelmed by the demands of the pandemic. Or maybe they hoped they could find a volunteer to care for him. The paper concluded, this is one of the extremely sad cases that are the pitiable result of the Jim Crow policy practiced in white hospitals of the city. And then fast forward to 2020. Toward the end of March of this year, Gary Fowler, an African-American man from Detroit, began feeling short of breath. He was aware of the growing risk of COVID-19, and so he immediately sought to find someone who might test him and might help him with what became his worsening symptoms. He visited 3 different ERs, but no one would help him. As it became more and more difficult for him to breathe, he began sleeping in a recliner chair in the bedroom near his wife. And then on the night of April 6th, in the middle of the night at some point, he wrote down heartbeat irregular and oxygen level low. And the next morning, April 7th, his wife found him and he had died in his recliner chair. He was 56 years old. In the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, though segregation like the Baltimore Afro-American had to report on is now outlawed, the consequences of white supremacy in the midst of a global health crisis are shockingly no less visible. And this is not the only striking similarity between the two pandemics. Now, I'm well aware there are lots and lots of differences between what happened in 1918 and what is happening, I should say, to us right now. Ready access to air travel made COVID-19's rapid international spread possible. And today, also though, our rapid identification of the novel coronavirus has given us the ability to test for infection and for the antibody and to conduct research that will soon, we hope, but eventually certainly lead to a vaccine. Ventilators are saving lives that would have been lost in 1918 because antibiotics can help with those secondary infections. Ventilators and antibiotics. Computer modelers have been able to map the possible spread of the pandemic and the impact of different public health measures. While the ease of information sharing sometimes makes room for the worst misinformation, and I'm afraid for some crazy conspiracy theories, it also allows us to have access to the most current expert information. And finally, unlike in 1918, we're not a nation in the midst of a world war, with the drain on resources that involved. Our crisis today is of a very different sort indeed. But despite all these differences, what's been most striking for me about COVID-19 has been how closely the experiences paralleled those of 1918. Now, the 2 examples with which I began, those which signaled the persistence of horrific racial disparities in the midst of a shared catastrophe, suggest only one of many correspondences between the 2 moments. Now, the similarities are not exact, but they're nevertheless quite stunning to me, and it's those that I want to focus on today. I'll start by providing some sort of essential overview context of what took place in 1918 to situate people. And then I want to talk about 7 different correspondences. And by interrogating the comparisons, I hope I can answer the question of ultimately, how is it possible that so little has changed? And what does that mean in terms of what we should be doing now and how we should be thinking about moving forward? So the essentials. During the early spring of 1918, the first wave of the pandemic swept through the country, but it was largely unnoticed and unheralded. It was indistinguishable really from what people just saw as, okay, it's the end of our winter of flu. Scholars today even continue to disagree about the origins, but it appears that patient zero lived in Kansas. It was military epidemiologists, though, who actually realized that something was going on and took note. They kept noticing that it was striking young people especially hard, that it was actually killing some of these young people. And they noticed then in postmortem examinations that the lungs had some peculiarities. They were soggy and they showed evidence of hemorrhaging. But as I say, the public in the United States was largely oblivious to this, just figuring some flu was passing through. But the virus attracted the world's attention when it went with those American soldiers overseas to the battlefronts in Europe, where it sickened first soldiers, but then relatively quickly the civilian populations of Europe as well. And then it spread around the world in the course of about 4 months. And then it would mutate into its most deadly form, which would create the horrors that we think of, that we associate with the 1918 pandemic, when it struck then in a second wave, almost simultaneously, in fact, in Sierra Leone, in France, and in the United States in late August. Within 2 months, the entire world was drenched in the sickness, a terrible disease that bore very little resemblance to traditional or normal flu. Though it arrived in Boston in late August, by the end of October, American cities from coast to coast were awash in the disease. From Chicago to Chattanooga, from Syracuse to Seattle, the country was drowning in a sea of disease. A third wave would follow this autumn wave sometime during the winter, and then a fourth wave, or perhaps it was the first seasonal version of the influenza, would strike again in early 1920. As I say, though, it was that autumn wave, the second wave, that was the most costly. Experts today disagree, as we're prone to do, but the assumption is that something like a third of human beings on the globe at the time may have been sickened, something like 500 million people. American infection rates were closer to probably a quarter of our population, and some 25 million people then were sick. Now, seasonal influenza and earlier flu pandemics had usually killed only about 0.1% of its victims, of those who sickened, and that's actually still similar to what we see with seasonal flu. But this flu struck with a really shocking mortality rate of 2.5%. So that, combined with how infectious it was, meant that some 675,000 Americans died over the course of just about a half a year. And in fact, that was severe enough to lower life expectancy in the United States for the single year of 1918 by 12 years. Now that statistic's really interesting, and it's driven in part by something that was unusual about this particular illness, which I want to make clear was quite distinct from and different from COVID-19. While COVID seems to be taking its victims from especially the elderly, and that's usually what influenza would do as well. In 1918, influenza did something a little unusual. You can see from the dotted line in front of you that that's what a normal flu mortality chart would look like. Flu takes its victims from the young and the old. But in 1918, instead of the U, we got this W. And what that means is that something like 50% of the American victims were drawn from people between the ages of 20 and 40. You can imagine the kind of social and economic devastation that surely meant. A couple of other quick things to mention that made this disease different from the one we're suffering with now is that it could sicken and kill people literally in one day. You could awaken healthy and be dead by nightfall. But you also didn't become you didn't become infectious until you were symptomatic. Whereas, as we know now, COVID-19, you may be infectious for several days before symptoms, or you may never have symptoms. But despite the difference in the two viruses, their impact and the behaviors of Americans bear striking similarities. So let me turn to my 7 parallels. Parallel 1, how could this happen to us? In November, I gave a talk. This was pointed out to me recently in an interview for a podcast. I gave a talk at the National World War I Memorial and Museum as part of a World War I event on 1919. And I remarked in closing, we know today that epidemic disease is not only a thing of the past, but also likely part of our future. Now, I said those words aloud just about a half a year ago, and I said them countless times over the preceding 20 years. But I'm as surprised as everybody else to find myself living in this thing. Unfortunately, it seems that my surprise, my complete lack of either intellectual or practical preparedness is a national phenomenon. And that's the first parallel I want to talk about. Now, given the characteristics of H1N1 in 1918, its pace, its high mortality rate, the victims it claimed, and the reality that it was a very ugly and horrific disease, makes it make sense that Americans were shocked when the epidemic struck. Even the most practiced, well-traveled medical physicians were sort of stunned, shocked. They talked about being startled and alarmed by what they saw among their patients. And lay people too talked about it as a conflagration, a horrible nightmare, a storm, a cyclone, that it was something you could not even describe. Or in a subtle critique, they would suggest it bore a lot of resemblance to a plague of olden times. And as this last comment suggests, Americans' shock at the pandemic also reflected their belief that this simply shouldn't be happening to them. Over the preceding half century, bacteriological research had led to revolutions in public health and in medicine. Scientists had identified the causal agents of lots of diseases that had been terrible troublemakers in American life previously. Things like dysentery, malaria, scarlet fever, leprosy, bubonic plague, bacterial pneumonia. I could go on and on. And these advancements only encouraged the growth of a really boisterous and strong public health movement, one that was made even more powerful during the 20 years or so of the progressive reform era immediately preceding the pandemic. So in 1918, you have public health leaders before the pandemic strikes saying things like epidemics are a thing of the past. Well, that confidence in the early moments probably interfere with their making the right choices. They really believed they could contain this thing. As one public health leader suggested, we ought to be in time to prevent the epidemic from assuming severe proportions if there's anything to public health education at all. Physicians were similarly optimistic. And sometimes these folks mixed in a bit of American exceptionalism to boot. As New York's health commissioner told his citizens when rumors began to circulate that influenza was in New York Harbor, an arriving ship, he said to the city, "You haven't heard of our doughboys," meaning our American soldiers, "getting it, have you?" And continued, "You bet you haven't and you won't, but you have heard of cases in the German army." And he concluded that there was, quote, "no need for our people to worry over the matter." That confidence did little to slow the pandemic, but certainly slowed public health responses to the looming threat. And unfortunately, we've been seeing much of the same in 2020. President Trump, for instance, was seemingly surprised by the advent of a pandemic under his watch. Who would have thought, he questioned, on March 6th during a trip to the CDC? Maybe he'd been swayed by his own optimistic pronouncements. On January 29th, with the coronavirus already reported in 17 countries, he tweeted, "We have the best experts anywhere in the world, and they're on top of it 24/7. On February 24th, he told us, "The coronavirus is very much under control in the USA." And on March 2nd, he reminded us that we're ranked right now by far #1 for preparedness. And a few days later noted that we had fewer cases than a lot of other places and concluded it will end. The belief that we were somehow going to dodge this global bullet did not encourage the rapid response that the coronavirus really demanded. Well, these presidential missteps have not stopped, but have continued to complicate rather than facilitate our national response to COVID-19, another parallel to 1918. When the pandemic struck in the fall of 1918, the United States was a nation at war. We were in the closing months, and Woodrow Wilson was absolutely and determinedly focused on that war. Now, he'd been unwilling to use taxes to pay for the war, so he'd relied on the selling of bonds to pay for World War I. So in the fall of 1918, though the East Coast was now engulfed in influenza, he did not delay the fourth Liberty Loan Drive. So cities and towns across the country, under significant pressure to come through, anxious to demonstrate their patriotism in the midst of the war, used large public events to kick off local drives, and the results were often costly. On September 28th in the city of Philadelphia, there was a massive parade downtown. 1/9 of the city's population, 200,000 people showed up. That's the image in the lower right corner. 3 days later, the city had 635 new influenza cases in a single day, foreshadowing what would become Philadelphia's catastrophic encounter with the pandemic. Wilson also failed to halt troop shipments to Europe, not only encouraging the spread of disease within the US, soldiers traveled to points of embarkation, but also causing difficulties at the Western Front as well, as some 16,000 soldiers would die and thousands more were sickened and unable to fight. But perhaps most shocking of Woodrow Wilson's actions was his inaction. He never spoke publicly of the pandemic, ever. At a moment when 25 million Americans were sickened, more than 500,000 died, he offered no words of guidance and no words of sympathy. Now, if Wilson's silence is striking, President Trump's ongoing commentary has often proved misleading, destructive, and divisive. According to CNN, between January 29th and May 3rd, the president made 215 false claims about the coronavirus pandemic, ranging from his March 6th comment that anybody that wants a test can get a test, to his suggestions that President Barack Obama had left the strategic national stockpile empty of ventilators. On Thursday, April 24th, the president offered ideas for COVID-19 research that included suggestions about the use of bleach, noting, "I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute. Is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning?" Physicians across the country reacted obviously with consternation. He's also repeatedly advocated treating the disease with hydroxychloroquine. Last month at the very tail end of May, The Lancet published a study that suggests that the ingestion of this drug has no benefits for COVID patients, but instead heightens risks of heart problems and raises the mortality risk. Perhaps most troubling, on April 17th, the president encouraged protests against social distancing measures in tweets that demanded "Liberate Michigan, liberate Minnesota, liberate Virginia, and save your great Second Amendment, it is under siege." The president's refusal in turn to wear a mask has politicized the wearing of masks in a way I could never have imagined, to be honest. And in doing so has undercut the practice of this really basic public health protection of those around us. And all of this, of course, has complicated the work of other leaders. Which brings me to another parallel. With the vacuum of leadership from the White House, other national agencies and organizations, as well as state and local leaders, have had to step up to guide the response to COVID, again mirroring the locus of leadership in 1918. Though the United States Public Health Service did not have the power to determine policy, the agency and its Surgeon General, Rupert S. Blue, pictured here, played a significant role. They deployed their doctors and nurses to those places that were in crisis, and they also played a really significant role in public education. The Red Cross, in turn, led efforts to mitigate the nursing shortage, organizing and moving nurses from community to community. They established and supplied hospitals and kitchens. They provided transportation for patients, as you can see here. They helped organize the making of masks, an activity all too familiar, I think, probably to some in the audience. And they also participated again in the efforts to educate, as did professional organizations like the American Public Health Association, the AMA, and the National Medical Association, an organization for physicians who were African American who were prohibited from joining the AMA. All of these groups worked to organize their memberships for service, designed programs, assisted city and local areas, mobilized in turn educational resources, and perhaps most importantly, collected data. Even so, much of the work and almost all of the decision-making fell on state and local leadership. The Civil War had really given an impetus to public health efforts. And in the wake of that war, several cities established what would become really meaningful and powerful public health boards. In New York, for instance, Chicago, St. Louis, Cincinnati, and several states did the same. And in many communities, the reform drives of the progressive era reinforced this and enhanced the power of boards in communities all over the country, including our own. World War I, in turn, had made really clear that there were a lot of problems with American health, a discovery made by way of a lot of unhealthy people turning out for the draft. It had also helped people recognize the importance of adhering to certain kinds of public health guidance. Even so, as I say, despite this appreciation for it, the organization and power of public health forces varied extraordinarily across the country. And today too, while the CDC and the Public Health Service have offered significant information about the virus, the pandemic, recommendations, they don't organize our policy. Instead, again, it's been governors as well as mayors and those in county government to determine what will happen to each of us, what restrictions we will live under. And volunteers have proven essential in handling many of the needs the pandemic has revealed. Now, this points to my next parallel. because we're all aware of I have to use the word wildly different responses to the pandemic that have emerged from this dispersal of public health decision-making in the present. And that was true in 1918 as well. Now, the strategies available in 1918 for containing the pandemic were largely the same ones we're trying to use today: education, hygiene, social distancing, quarantining, closures, masking. Like today, too, each community's response was shaped by variation in the power of the particular state and local governments and their health boards, by the particular political environments and personalities, and by the attitudes, of course, of the public. Some cities like Milwaukee, Wisconsin, faced the pandemic ready to go. A very progressive city, they were ready with a fulsome, robust healthcare system, public healthcare system. Other communities, for instance, Spokane, handled the pandemic well, but struggled through tensions created by warfare, literally open warfare between political and public health leaderships. In other communities, such as Philadelphia, political corruption interfered with the decision-making early on in the pandemic and delayed and ultimately undercut their quick response. And still other cities like San Francisco, the simple failure of leadership led to citizen resistance against something that may sound familiar. San Francisco was pretty slow to implement its first round of responses and to close down the city during its first wave. But what was most interesting was the failure of the leadership to model for the citizens the most basic compliance with the restrictions they'd put in place. When the city reopened in November, they kept a masking order in place. It soon became toothless and was rescinded not long after the mayor and the health commissioner were both spotted at a boxing match without masks on. Needless to say, when the city suffered a resurgence of influenza and the city wanted to re-implement a masking order, there was massive resistance. It took more than a month for the city to finally decide to put that order in place. And when they did, this is when the now famous Anti-Mask League formed to protest it. Without strong modeling from the leadership then, the public resisted and the efforts floundered. Now, Seattle's story is a much better one, it seems to me. It offers an example, again, not unfamiliar, of a well-coordinated and effective response. It may not have felt that way at the time, however. They didn't have the data about themselves that we have. Here's the story. On October 4th, the story breaks. The Naval Training Center at the UW campus has a cadet that has died. 400 cadets are sick, and there's 700 sick, supposedly. The next day, then, the city health commissioner, in concert with the mayor, enacts the first round of restrictions. They're calling for strict enforcement of the anti-spitting laws, better ventilation on streetcars, no more dancing, and hoping for the self-quarantining of the sick. Well, that wasn't going to be enough because, of course, this was a really difficult virus to contain. And so, spurred by county auditors, literally the next day, just 2 days after the first headline about the flu, the city shut down public amusements, as well as churches and schools. Now, the public was stunned by how fast that had happened, and there were initially quite a bit of complaining. The post-intelligencers certainly had a bit of an uproar. School and church leadership complained, as did business owners. Within days, though, the city's new influenza squad of the local police watched for violations of the orders, and the citizenry was actually pretty compliant. Once again, though, even the closure wasn't enough to stop the pandemic, and more organization and more restrictions were necessary. The Red Cross created a special influenza committee to sort of organize the effort. A new emergency hospital was established on the upper floor of what was now the old King County Courthouse. When the city continued to face new cases, 3,500 by mid-October, the health commissioner decided to enforce the law more strictly and asked police to arrest those caught spitting or breaking the closure orders, and perhaps even put them in jail, fine them, and maybe publish their names in the newspaper and see if you couldn't get the city to behave. And he warned if that didn't happen, he'd close the city down completely. By early November, things had not receded just yet, and so he decides as well to add in public masking, the one measure he hadn't yet tried. And in the aftermath of that, though not necessarily directly linked to that, but was in his own mind, I suspect, the thing did begin to recede. By November 12th, he was ready to lift the closure order. You'll note he waited until the day after the armistice, however. Suggesting his caution about lifting the closure order as well, he discovered right after he announced the lifting that the county was lifting the masking order, and he was infuriated. He said he would not have lifted the closure if he'd known that his masking order would no longer be enforceable. Well, as was common for many cities around the country, and we all are familiar now with the idea of waves, not long after, the city then suffered its second wave. That happened in early December. This time, the mayor decided that, being hopeful, that perhaps just quarantining the cases would be enough. The public was ready to cooperate, and over the course of just the first 5 days, 1,000 homes had quarantine placards placed on them. Unfortunately, this measure did prove to be enough, and the city, came out of its flu pandemic. Now, the reality is that until the end of February, there were still people hospitalized in that emergency hospital with the flu. But Seattle's response really is a great example of the imposition of interventions relatively early, with some strictness, and a persistence in maintaining and even enhancing them through the worst of the wave, and a willingness to reimpose restrictions as needed. Well, in 2020, we've also been fortunate here in Washington and King County to have strong and informed leadership that's acted quickly and transparently to protect us during the pandemic. And I won't rehearse that for you. I think people, having lived through it, don't need much. I'll just say a few things. I want to call our attention, because I have the opportunity to do so, frankly, to the many lives lost and lost early at the Life Care Center in Kirkland. Those people should not have died. And in fact, that nursing home is now facing a fine of some $600,000 and sanctions as well. But I want to suggest that the people who died there really are martyrs in a sense, if unwilling ones nevertheless, in the state's struggle with the coronavirus. Their deaths, without question, for me, hastened the actions of Governor Jay Inslee and countless other political, educational, religious, and business leaders in the Puget Sound region who actually moved relatively swiftly to impose closures, to encourage public masking, and to impose ultimately stay-at-home orders. Alternatively, in a lot of other communities, we've seen, widely varying responses, and the stay-at-home orders can be a way to think about that. California imposed its on March 19th, Oregon on March 23rd, ours came on March 24th. Governor Kemp of Georgia alternatively waited until April 2nd. And he only imposed it, he said, because he had just discovered that the virus is now transmitting before people see the signs. Actually, we'd known that for a month at that point. Governor Hutchinson of Arkansas refused to put a statewide stay-at-home order into effect and actually stepped in the way of the mayor of Little Rock, who was attempting to impose their own. To date, that state still has no stay-at-home order. Neither does North Dakota. Now, as states begin to imagine how to emerge from the lockdown orders, the variation is again expansive and perhaps growing more so. And that may actually, at this point, be appropriate. We do need people to be able to return to work. We need them to be safe in doing so. And in some places, the risk associated with that is much lower than it is in other places. That can even vary county to county in a lot of locations, which means that a slow but careful county by county response is really smart, much like what's happening in Washington. But that said, the images of crowds protesting stay-at-home orders, of Memorial Day weekend pool parties in Lake of the Ozarks and crowded beach parties and beach towns in Florida and California are really worrisome and suggest the consequences of our scattershot approach to handling the COVID-19 pandemic. And the reason those images are so troubling is that the evidence from 1918 is really clear. Public health restrictions save lives. Seattle suffered 1,400 influenza and pneumonia deaths during the 6 main months of the pandemic. Its per capita death rate, though, was one of the lowest on the West Coast, significantly better than that of San Francisco and half of that of some cities. Philadelphia, remember, where 1/9 of the city's population turned up for that parade? They suffered desperately. On October 12th alone, 837 people died. Remember, the total for Seattle, 1,400. In a single week, that city suffered 4,500 deaths. And by its end, 17,500 people had died, and the city had gone through a horrific and gruesome pandemic. You can see in the image on the left what were described as rows upon rows of the uninterred dead. And you can see as well both city workers and divinity students digging the mass graves. These examples may seem anecdotal, fair enough, but you need to know that research by scholars at the CDC in partnership with historians at the University of Michigan have proven pretty definitively that non-pharmaceutical interventions, or NPIs, if you want to sound really in the know, these prohibition on public events, the closures, the masking, the quarantines, that these things, if put in place and maintained through the worst of a pandemic, make a difference. They save lives. They lower not only morbidity, but mortality rates. And it appears that there's a secondary effect as well. It appears from recent studies that these same cities that experienced lower mortality rates also experienced faster economic recovery in the aftermath. It's probably too early to offer any definitive conclusions on how the range of responses are playing out in the midst of COVID-19, this crazy scattershot thing we're seeing. Already, though, we have seen evidence that the early imposition, again, of social distancing, closures, quarantining, and masking served us well here and is serving us well here in the Puget Sound region. We're living with a flattened curve. It doesn't mean people aren't still getting sick and dying, but they're doing so at a slower rate, which is preventing the overwhelming of our healthcare provision. This is really different, of course, from what happened in some cities, most notably and most horrifically in New York City. What's not yet clear, I guess, is the comparison to other communities, those with laxer restrictions, those with substantial citizen defiance of the rules, and also those that are opening up really quickly. We just don't yet know. But the data from 1918 is really clear. Indeed, an important difference between our own time and their time is that we have their data. We know public health interventions save lives. We have their experiences on which to base our decisions. And so I need to turn to the most obvious parallel. It's so obvious that perhaps you'd think, why bother to bring it up? But I think we have to pause for a moment to realize that at the center of this story is trauma and loss, that these are the defining experiences. And this isn't a phenomenon I can illustrate with statistics or graphs. So let me just tell a story. On September 12, 1918, 15-year-old Edith Potter left her home in California on an Indian reservation to enroll in 4th grade at the Chemawa Indian School in Salem, Oregon, not far south of here. The school had been founded in 1880, just 1 year after the inaugural off-reservation, quote, Indian school. Schools that were based on the similar premise that the somehow seemingly intractable Indian problem could be solved through the kind of forced Americanization process, with young people removed from their culture, their communities, and even their parents. That was what Edith Potter was in for. She passed a required medical exam. Just a few weeks later, though, on October 18th, the superintendent of the school wrote to her home reservation with the worrisome news that she was sick with influenza, though seemingly in no danger as yet. This is how flu worked. Just hours after the letter was posted, the superintendent followed up with a telegram warning that Edith was now seriously ill with influenza. And the next day, on October 20th, another telegram was sent to California, this time with the tragic news that Edith Potter had died of influenza that morning and would, of necessity, be buried that same day. The following week, the school superintendent sent Edith's mother a copy of a form letter personalized with Edith's name. This is from a different family. Here on the screen, you can see it's a form letter. It had details with her name and about the funeral and promised that absolutely everything had been done. This did little to ease her mother's trauma or sense of loss. She hoped desperately to bring her daughter's body home so that she could bury her properly according to traditions. And she was frustrated to learn that that was simply impossible and she'd have to wait at least a year before she could apply for such a thing. Now, because only fragments of their story survived in the written record, I don't know what happened to Edith Potter's body. But I like her story as an example because I think it really reveals this sort of essential reality of the themes of suffering in 1918. How quickly the loss could come, how devastating the suffering by the sick and those who loved them really was, and also the public chaos that resulted from the reality of a pandemic. Now, there was actually not very much written about the pandemic and its aftermath, but I can say that the records I did find, the novels and memoirs that were produced, the interviews, The transcripts of surveys of World War veterans again and again communicate the idea that this pandemic was horrific and that they live with the sense of loss for the rest of their lives. It's not coincidental, perhaps, that it's only in the blues that the memory of the pandemic was musically inscribed. I don't want to recount the trauma and tragedy of the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic that people are living through right now. It's too raw, too near the surface for too many people. But I do want to point out that today, as in 1918, many families are separated from their loved ones. In 1918, it was because of the war. Today, it's because of our efforts to quarantine the sick. And indeed, even the critically ill are required to suffer in isolation, leaving families helpless and heartbroken. And today, as in 1918, the sorrow of loss is exacerbated by public health measures that prohibit the proper laying to rest, that hold such deep meaning for so many communities in the country. And this only scratches the surface of the suffering. We might remember, of course, the economic consequences of the pandemic today, and the ways our public health measures have devastated people across the country, and how we have moved too slowly and too inadequately to protect our most vulnerable populations nationwide. And that moves to my final parallel and returns me as well to the stories with which I began today. The reality that the suffering that we're going through right now is inequitably distributed, just as it was in 1918, that it's too often tied, in fact, to a person's social identity, perhaps the most horrific of the parallels between 1918 and 2020 that I want to draw today. You see, despite the massive disruption of much of Americans' way of life in the midst of the pandemic in 1918, one category of behaviors survived untouched. And this was the adherence to cultural norms and hierarchies regarding social identity. These weathered the storm unchanged, creating experiences of the crisis that were drastically divergent. Some of these won't feel quite as familiar, I hope. For instance, in the strict adherence to really strict gender rules, men and women faced really different demands on their behavior in 1918. Men were supposed to remain stoic and scoff at the possibility of getting sick and carry guilt alongside their misery when they did come down with the flu. Women were understood alternatively to have natural capacities for nursing, and they were expected, in fact, to volunteer for that role. There were more tangible impacts from gender as well. Men who lost wives sometimes found themselves responsible for children, a role that they were sometimes not even socially sanctioned to fulfill. In the time without a meaningful safety net, the loss of the male of the family, often the sole breadwinner, but even if not an important breadwinner, could be devastating, leaving families scrambling to find a way to make a living. Lots of families solved this by sending the mother to work. Many others, however, solved it by sending children to work. Children made into adults and breadwinners literally overnight. And as this suggests, economic class then had a profound impact on Americans' experiences during the pandemic. For the poorest families, the basic problems of the epidemic were worsened by material need. Without a financial cushion, hunger, homelessness, cold, all might await them. And then, of course, for people of color, the circumstances were still more difficult. Their experiences framed even more fully by the disadvantages of racial prejudice and the broader poverty and segregated healthcare that they produced. Think back to Edith Potter. The Chamao Indian schools were breeding grounds for disease. In months preceding the epidemic, this place had children suffering from all kinds of health problems: tonsillitis, appendicitis, eye trouble, which was probably trachoma, scabies, stomach trouble, tuberculosis. Every month, at least some children were hospitalized. And when the pandemic hit, hundreds of children at the school died. Just the latest example of the long-time spread of disease and death among the indigenous peoples of what would become the United States. African Americans, too, struggled against white supremacy in the midst of the pandemic. In Chicago, the white press had already been stereotyping African Americans arriving in the city by way of the Great Migration as unhealthy. And the health commissioner, John Dill Robertson, actually blamed African Americans for the pandemic. In Richmond, Virginia, though the Red Cross created an emergency hospital that served all the city's citizens, in theory, African Americans were relegated to the basement. And in other communities, though emergency hospitals were open, they provided nothing for the Black community. And such was the case in Philadelphia. Remember the story with which we began. Baltimore, Philadelphia, communities of color across the country were left on their own to find the resources and leadership to create those spaces where their own people could be cared for. So facing the disorder of the pandemic, Americans with power relied on existing social norms as a bulwark, in a sense, against the chaos they saw around them. And the cost for those on the lower rungs of those hierarchical ladders could be extreme. Today, we know that the racial disparities of 1918 have not disappeared, but are landing with special force in the midst of this pandemic. Data suggests that African Americans, if you adjust the data for age of the population, are dying at 3 times the rate of white people, and members of the Latinx community at twice that of white people. The information has been slow in coming, but it appears that Native Americans, Alaska Natives, and Pacific Islanders are also suffering at rates much higher than their proportion of the population. The data, unfortunately, is also compromised because we still have 5 states, all of them states with large indigenous populations, that refuse to collect health data by race. And so we're left with a simple question. How is it possible that so little has changed? Put another way, what does this all mean? I want to make 2 points to conclude. First, one of the most striking features of the aftermath of the influenza pandemic of 19 was how quickly it disappeared from the nation's public consciousness. As Alfred Crosby rightly noted, it became America's forgotten pandemic, at least until now. No monuments were built, no commemorations were held, few memoirs or novels were written. This public amnesia was intimately linked, perhaps as both cause and effect, with the reality that in the aftermath of the pandemic, the United States, its political, social, cultural, and economic entity changed almost not at all. The nation did not decide to beef up the USPHS, to create equitable access to healthcare, to provide a social safety net, to protect their community's most vulnerable citizens. And the nation most certainly did not turn from its white supremacy. And this alludes to my second and final point. As we look at these 2 pandemics, separated by 102 years, by so many changes in science and technology, by meaningful progress in our social and cultural norms, it's crucial to ask what the persistent parallels suggest about how and why we haven't changed. What can it tell us about ourselves? I think our wonder at facing the pandemic, this profound sense that this should not be happening to us, suggests we have not yet come to terms with our belief in American exceptionalism, that we continue to believe as well that science can save us. In turn, our shameful lack of preparedness and the absence of a strong federal leadership suggest an ongoing unwillingness to accept the vital role that the federal government has to play in a modern nation. It also suggests our unwillingness to pay, to fund those agencies that might have prepared and guided us more comprehensively and effectively through this catastrophe. And finally, the racial disparities that this pandemic has highlighted remind us that this nation has hard and crucial work to do to deal with our systemic and institutionalized white supremacy, a point that must finally feel extraordinarily obvious and pressing today. George Floyd could not breathe. And this hails as well those people of color dying of COVID-19 who also cannot breathe. Both realities should make us all reel with grief and anger at this ongoing violence against African Americans in this country. I said at the beginning of this talk that one of the key differences between the people of 1918 and ourselves is that their story is finished. While we may continue to research and write about them, they are no longer enacting that history. We are still enacting ours. We don't yet know, however, whether we will choose to act on what we're experiencing and whether we'll choose to change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for that extremely powerful talk. I'd like to now ask my colleague Bruce Heavley to moderate the question and answer session.
Okay. Well, I'd just like to add my thanks for, I think, an extraordinary talk. It's difficult always for historians to I think, draw meaningful connections between the past and the present, and few of us succeed in doing it, but you've really succeeded, I think, admirably. And so my job is to kind of manage the multimedia extravaganza here and just pass some questions on to you that have come in and that are coming in now. And let me just begin with a kind of a broad one. I mean, I think in your last couple of points, you pointed out that we've made relatively little provision for discussing the 1918 flu in our American history textbooks or in our courses. Can you think of why that's the case? Why has it been of so little interest to historians?
I really appreciate that question, and I think it's a really pressing one. I'll give you two ideas that I have about it. The first is this way in which the pandemic didn't change anything. So in a sense, it didn't give us those social or cultural markers that would make us say, oh, right, the pandemic, that's when we all decided to do this, or that's when this began to happen. There isn't that. We gave up a common drinking cup. It's not really something to mark a culture. But I think the more important reason, the one that's really perhaps more tangible, is the ways in which the war is a part of this story. From the very beginning, the two stories are really intertwined. As I said, you couldn't get Wilson to speak of the pandemic. He was so preoccupied by the war. And in fact, public health measures were sold as sort of patriotic responses to the needs of a nation at war. Influenza became, Kaiser Wilhelm's greatest ally, so to speak. And so public health restrictions were sold as patriotic actions in the midst of a war. And as Americans looked for a way to make sense of what was happening, that kind of martial rhetoric worked really well because it meant people who died, it somehow wasn't so senseless. They could be martyrs in a cause if the pandemic was also part of the war. And that was actually language that was used repeatedly. And that sets up really easily a slide in the aftermath into sort of subsuming the pandemic under the war. And to be honest, I'm not sure it was intentional, but there's no question the war fit Americans' perceptions of themselves much better than the pandemic did. Think about American exceptionalism. Think about where the nation was at the end of World War I, a rising international power. We'd sort of gone over to Europe and won that war, that thing those Europeans were, let go on for years, millions of deaths, and we were just in and out, won the thing. Americans had that perception of themselves available to them as a storyline. And it seems to me that the one really overshadowed the other. And so for me, it's very much about the war that we have forgotten the pandemic. It becomes sort of a chapter in that story and then not even a chapter in the story because it doesn't fit very well with who Americans wanted to believe they were.
But I think, some of the audience is sort of trying to draw you out a little bit more on this, that if we think about all the things that we typically do address when we talk about American history after World War I, we talk about the very distinctive economy after World War I. We talk about women's suffrage.
Right.
We talk about all kinds of concern about social changes and the movement of populations. Is there a way that the experience of the epidemic kind of connects to those things that are very much a standard part of our history?
Oh, I think that's right. And that's what's so interesting about it is that it is certainly tied up, for instance, with women's suffrage and with the rise of nursing as a profession. For me, that's the most noteworthy, visible impact of the pandemic, is the ways in which women's status as healthcare providers really is given a boost. What's really hard, I think, is to separate out the difference between the pandemic's impact and the war's impact. Right. So the issue, a really important question that I'm sure was on the list, in fact, of questions that were asked ahead of time is, so what was the economic impact of the pandemic? Mm-hmm. And I don't know. I think scholars are still trying to sort that out, because separating it out from the post-war adjustment, from demobilization, from the return of soldiers, 4 million men had been drafted, right? Thousands of women have gone into the nursing corps. How do you separate out the impact of those two events? We do have figures for sort of how many dollars did it cost to have 675,000 Americans die? But that doesn't really speak very wholly or holistically to the economic impacts, for instance. So yeah, I think you could see that those happened, but for historians, sort of teasing them out is difficult. And those things that you could make a direct comparison to, so for instance, changing the public health system, which Canada did, didn't happen here, even though they did happen in other places. The kind of things that you could say, A leads to B, like changes in healthcare or a fuller safety net, or those things didn't happen in the aftermath. But no, I think those are really good correctives, and I appreciate the pushback.
What about if we think of some, cultural institutions? Did you find that the pandemic had a discernible effect on the history of the American university or on art movements in the period after the war? Again,
to figure out the pandemic's impact is almost impossible. What I immediately think of a yearbook that I saw at the University of Virginia. I was just looking in the yearbook to see if it mentioned anything about the pandemic, because again, college age kids were pretty close or within that sort of main category of deaths. The few people on that campus who died of influenza were included among the war dead in the yearbook. And so again, to be able to tease out the impact on higher education is not something I've done. I'm not saying it couldn't be done, and I think it's a great question. Someone asked me that last week as well about K-12 or pre-K-12 education, but it's not easily discernible. Hopefully there's some really smart young graduate student who's about to take that on and will answer that mystery for us. In the literary world, it's really interesting. There's actually a brand new book out by Outka about the impact of the pandemic on modernism. And I have not, shamefully, have not yet read it. That's on the docket for this coming week, in fact. But she's got some interesting things to say, it seems. What's really interesting to me is how little writing there is about the pandemic. You have the best known works. They came like swallows from William Maxwell, not as well known, I suppose, but Thomas Wolfe's Look Homeward Angel, Catherine Ann Porter's Pale Horse, Pale Rider, Mary McCarthy's memoir, Willa Cather's One of Art, and that's it. I mean, I pretty much named them. And that to me is really quite striking in the context of that explosion of literature. I mean, how many soldiers wrote their own memoirs in the aftermath of the war? How many nurses wrote their memoir of their time in the pandemic? Very, very few.
So you've talked about the faith in modern kind of biomedical science going into the pandemic. It seems to me that, as one of the audience has pointed out, immigration restrictions that were put in place in the 1920s also appealed to a real faith in some kind of biomedical scientific knowledge, at least as represented. Do you think the pandemic provides any kind of a useful link there? Did that have an effect on the willingness of political authorities to embrace restrictions on immigration?
Be interesting. The reason I'm sort of pausing is that Alan Kraut's work on this very question of, were immigrants perceived to have been responsible for the pandemic, which is what all of us kind of expected, didn't find that. Certainly there's an assumption that it's Germany's fault, but often that's pretty short-lived. It's kind of a small folder at the National Archives filled with some fairly crazy letters to the Secretary of War. And there's a conspiracy theory that it's Bayer's aspirin that causes influenza for a little while. But in general, the immigrant communities were not targeted for this one. Germans were targeted for the war, so this was just an add-on. So I'm not sure about that link. One thing you see in Congress that makes me think there's not a connection is the ways in which, in the aftermath of the pandemic, there are calls immediately to, let's give the Public Health Service $5 million to go do research. Okay, maybe it should be 2 million, 1 million, 500,000, okay, 250,000. Congress doesn't give the USPHS a penny. So there's sort of belief in the authority of at least a federal agency connected with science was low. They didn't want to fund it. Did they nevertheless believe in science? The record would suggest some did and some didn't, not unlike I fear today.
So you also mentioned the change in the position of the United States as a world power. Is there, I mean, now we have a sense that that position is slipping very substantially. But did the flu have an effect on negotiations at the end of the war? Was Wilson himself perhaps influenced by disease?
Yeah.
And
that's one of those questions that's definitely out there. And I will be honest that my interest in that question has never been as great as perhaps it should be. My interest in studying the flu was really to look at the lives and experiences of those whose names we don't know. So I didn't actually go into the Wilson archives and explore that as closely as one could. Other scholars have done that. I haven't found it particularly persuasive. My sense is that people want to draw that link, but I don't think we can know. Again, a conversation with another scholar just, I don't know, 2 days ago, maybe sometime over the weekend, he was agreeing that you can see that people in the Paris piece, the people that are traveling with Wilson, some of them get sick. Willard Straight even dies. We know Colonel House was sick. Did Wilson just have a really bad cold or the flu? I don't know. That I actually have looked at. I've seen some of his diary entries from that moment, and it's not clear. Did that then affect the piece? I don't know. I don't know. I think that's one of those questions that I'm not sure we can answer. And for me, it's interesting because it speaks to this desire that the flu only matters if, it shaped the piece. And I keep wanting to pull us back to what about the 675,000 people who died? What about the ways in which some communities really suffered differentially? What about the ways in which we were completely unprepared for it? All those things that I think could have led us, had we continued to teach the pandemic, could have led us to have some different ideas about how to be best prepared for a pandemic of the future, or what we would now call our pandemic of the present.
Well, along those lines then, and maybe, thinking about winding things up a little bit, did anyone build monuments to those that died in the pandemic, and should they have done?
I think it's not surprising that they did not. It was a time of war. We built war memorials. The nation had been in a war for a longer time period. And war is something that we were more familiar with. And as I say, that fit better with the narrative. You could celebrate the losses of the war and have a sense that it had meaning, that it had progressed the country toward the future that we wanted and needed. And to do that with the pandemic would have been very difficult. And to be clear, I may sound really critical of the people of 1918, and right now I should just apologize across the board because I have a whole new sympathy for how hard it must have been to go through what they did and how much they didn't know what was coming, that level of uncertainty. And so I appreciate the ways in which people were anxious to, in a sense, move on after the pandemic. And so perhaps to ask them to have memorialized or commemorated is too much to ask. And yet today we know some things that they didn't. We know, for instance, that recovery from trauma is really facilitated by having the opportunity to tell your story, to have people listen to you and to actually hear what you're saying about what has happened to you. And so perhaps they didn't remember, and perhaps it would have been very difficult for them to remember, but I think we're in a different time. And I think the meaning of remembering plays differently in our culture now than it did then, perhaps. So I think if they couldn't, I won't say they should, but perhaps they couldn't, perhaps we could. And I mentioned, in fact, literally the people in Kirkland, because my brother and I have talked about the importance of at some point making an effort to have those people memorialized in some way, because they surely saved a lot of lives. And that's the kind of remembering that I think can make what does feel completely senseless to us as we live through it have some kind of meaning. And by that I mean to say that we could, by remembering, help people find their way through the losses that they're suffering, something that may feel impossible to do. And yet to listen can in fact be one part of helping people find new and different lives in the aftermath of terrible trauma.
Is what you've just said a possible postscript to the next edition of American Pandemic?
I hadn't even thought about that. But I do think it's something that I'm encouraged to see as a real possibility. One thing that's happening nationwide right now is archivists at universities and colleges all over the country, and I think other archives as well, are actively engaging their communities and encouraging them to write about what's happening so that the historians of the very near future are able to tell our story and to tell everyone's story, not just the story of the Woodrow Wilsons of our own time. And so in a sense, I feel encouraged that it's possible that I won't need to write the postscript because somebody else will be writing the new books.
Well, there are a number of really good questions still in my queue, but I can't imagine a better place to stop than that in terms of coming to a great conclusion. So thank you very, very much for your talk.
Oh, thank you so much. Such an honor to be invited. And I so appreciate all the really thoughtful questions. And I only wish that I could have seen more of the faces of the people with whom I'm talking. So again, thank you to all of you for being with us and for giving me this opportunity.
And I'd like to thank Professor Bristow, Chair of the History Department at the University of Puget Sound, for a talk that has provided so much clarity, penetrating clarity, on the unsettling parallels between pandemic then and now. I'd like to remind you that she's the author of a recently published book, Steeped in the Blood of Racism, Black Power, Law and Order, and the 1970 Shootings at Jackson State College. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Professor James Gregory and Bruce Heavley, for their contributions today. I'd like to extend special thanks to Alexandra Colley and Kim McCaig and the rest of the History Department staff. And I'd like to thank our audience for their questions and for being part of this intellectual event. So thank you, everyone. And again, thank you, Professor Bristow. We expect to post this talk on our website.
Great. Thank you so much. Take good care.
Take good care, everyone.